Have you been shopping for a used Mercedes? I recently was, and I bought one too because they are absolutely legendary for their style, innovation, luxury, amenities, as well as overall durability. But with the durability comes the odd flop. So I'm going to give you a list of a few Mercedes engines and the vehicles you can find them in, and likely won't even make 100,000 miles, no matter how well you take care of them. Let's get into it now. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Mark with Exotic Car Play Place. So the first engine on my list of engines to avoid in the Mercedes world is the M272 and 273, built from roughly 2004 to 2008, and it's essentially a naturally aspirated or normally aspirated V6 engine. So you've got to ask yourself, how can you go wrong buying a vehicle with one of these engines? For example, a bunch of models that carry this particular drivetrain are SLK, CLS, C-Class, E-Class, S-Class, SLML, and as well the GLK, all with the 350 nomenclature. Now, it doesn't take very long to scour the internet and you can quickly find lots of forum conversation around this particular engine. Lots of issues, and a couple big ones are the timing chains, which of course if a timing chain breaks, being an interference engine, piston and cylinder meet, and whambo! It's all over but the crying, and you can face a massive repair bill for a new engine. Another problem was premature wear on a balanced shaft gears. Now there's inspections that you can do to try to get ahead of it, but at the end of the day, to properly correct it, you can expect to pay upwards around $4,000 plus to get that properly sorted out. How about the plastic lever within the variable length intake manifold? Because that lever itself is plastic, it's fragile, they're known to break. If that breaks, you get poor running conditions and ultimately possibly check engine lights. It's not a good situation. Now, unfortunately, Mercedes-Benz hasn't come up with a real good solution, so it's not a matter of just replacing the plastic lever. You've got to purchase a whole new intake manifold. Any idea what that costs? Try close to $1,000 for that part alone. So it doesn't have a whole high list of problems other than typical things like oil leaks and coolant leaks, but the big ones are the fact that they're so prevalent and they're so expensive to fix that I can't help but share the fact that these engines are best to be avoided. So the second engine I would suggest staying away is the OM651. That's a 4-cylinder turbo diesel engine. You can either get them in a single turbo or twin turbo setup. These engines are part of that whole new Daimler Chrysler collaboration. And generally you find these engines from 2008 and newer, and you'll find them in vehicles such as A-Class, B-Class, C-Class, E-Class, CLS, GLK, SLK, S-Class, and the list goes on and on. You're typically going to find the designations 180, 200, 220, 250, and 300 CDI diesels. Now, while they are great performers, they're very economical and they're punchy in their own right, you can expect issues with front and rear seals, timing chain failures once again, resulting in possible engine catastrophic failures, and the wonderful piezo injectors which start to leak down. Those get very costly, and there was an upgrade later on, but unfortunately a lot of owners had to pay the price. Another thing I have to point out is often a lot of the servicing with this engine meant that you had to remove it or partial engine removal just to gain access to certain components. So all in all, not a do-it-yourselfer engine, and certainly not the best engine for Mercedes in terms of durability. And the third engine that unfortunately pains me to say it, because it's such a great engine, a great drivetrain, and it is truly legendary. As a matter of fact, it powers some of the very best performance sports sedans and coupes, and that sadly is the 6.2-liter V8 AMG engine called the M156. Now you can find these engines were produced from 2007 to about 2015 when they were essentially bumped to the newer generation. Now sadly, these engines were in fact legendary, and it does hurt to talk about them in such a negative light because the AMG engine before the M156 was on the opposite end of the scale and absolutely one of the most durable, reliable, and best workhorse engines available in the Mercedes lineups. So what kind of cars can you find these in? Well, let's start with the E63, C63, ML63, CLS63, S63, CL63, R63, CLK63, and you get the rest of the hint, right? So there's all kinds of different problems. Let's just start from the top. How about engine codes, for example, like the P0170, not uncommon, due to the crankcase breather valve. These engines also had a plethora of oil leaks, which if you don't take care of them in time, that can start to make a real mess of things, for example in the pulleys, and cause damage on the front end of the engine and just a mess outright. But those are the least of the problems. One of the big problems is the broken head studs. Now most engines typically have head studs. That's what essentially bolts the head to the block. And unfortunately, as time goes on, there was corrosion that seeped into the studs as a result of coolant migration. As this corrosion set in, it started to weaken the studs, and over time, the massive torque of the engine started to twist and reef on those studs to the point where eventually they would just pop or snap right off completely. And the worst part is, if this happened during the transition phase where they didn't completely fail catastrophically yet, and you started to get a loosening of the head, you wound up with coolant in the cylinders, and as a result, you could actually wind up with a hydrolock. Hydrolock? Yeah, that's the point where you can no longer compress water, and ultimately you can bend rods, break internal engine parts. That is the worst case scenario, an absolutely devastating result. Now, fortunately, Mercedes learned about this and later on started producing these engines with the improved version. How can you tell if you've got the problem? Well, sometimes you can get a compression leak. You might be able to hear that, but other times you're going to get that white smoke. You look out the exhaust and you see white smoke. It's not exhaust, it's smoke. It's dense. You can tell. As well, you might find low coolant level all of a sudden out of nowhere, and you haven't noticed that for a long time, and all of a sudden out of the blue, you're down halfway and you start to realize, well, where's that coolant going? Well, there's a good chance it's gone into the combustion chamber. Another common issue with these vehicles is the intake manifold, which is based out of magnesium. The unfortunate part, it's the mounting plate which corrodes, and that then results in airflow, poor mixture, and of course, ultimately a rough idle or poor running conditions. You want to know another one? How about the camshaft lifters? They won't make 100,000 miles, virtually guaranteed. The cam lobes on the camshaft will start to eat away at the lifters because of the different material strengths. And when that happens, ultimately that starts to impact your valve lift. And of course, you can start getting misfiring or poor running conditions. Could result in engine codes ultimately and just a shaky or rough idle. Now, some of this premature wear can be avoided by using anti-wear additives, or just be sure that you're doing your oil services far in advance. I mean, a lot of the modern Mercedes and BMW cars, the manufacturers are now extending the service intervals way too long, in my opinion. I would kind of keep it more in that 6,000 mile range versus the 10 or above. Like, that's way too long, and that can contribute to premature wear on the internals of these engines. As I mentioned, you can see leaks, valve cover leaks, oil filter housing leaks, cam solenoid covers, and just leaks in general from a whole lot of different locations. Another problem? The cam adjusters. But unfortunately, the cam adjusters sometimes get a little rattly. They start making noise. There's too much slop in there. And on a cold start, you can get a little bit of extra noise and rattly. It almost sounds a little chain-like pulling through a garbage can, or just a general uneasy noise that you can hear from the engine. One more big one that seems to be creeping in all over the place. Service networks are identifying with them. There's a little bit more talk on the internet about it, and that is the injectors and leaking down injectors. And sadly, the problem with that isn't just running rich or running lean, which can cause problems of their own. It's they can fill cylinders. If they fill cylinders without you knowing, obviously it'll have an impact on its running, but even worse, it can wash the cylinders. If you wash a cylinder, you lose oil, you can start scraping the cylinder walls and create extra problems. You start wearing down the cylinder walls, which then results in possible loss in compression. And even worse, hydrolocking. Again, if you fill a cylinder with gas, gasoline itself in the gas format is made to ignite. But gas as a liquid doesn't compress in the same way. And if you fill a cylinder with gas, it can hydrolock and again bend a connecting rod or break internal engine parts. A sad state of affairs for such a legendary engine. And so sadly, none of these engines will likely make 100,000 miles unless you want to sell your third born to pay for the third mortgage to cover the cost to repair these cars. And with all of that said, be sure to click on that video. It's going to tell you every single reason Mercedes-Benz doesn't hold its value. Hope to see you guys real soon. Catch you then. Bye-bye.